Honda was one of the first companies to create a modern gasoline-electric hybrid vehicle and then bring that vehicle to the United States with the very original Honda Insight. But since then, Honda seems to have not spent too much time developing hybrids for the North American market. But that's all changing with the advent of this new Insight, the new Honda Clarity lineup, and of course, a new Accord hybrid as well. Honda has promised that a large portion of the vehicles sold in North America will be electrified in some way or another very shortly, and this is the beginning of that transition. Although this vehicle wears the Insight name, it is very different than the Insights that have come before it. The hybrid system under the hood really shares nothing with those outgoing models in terms of parts content or really in terms of theory of operation either. And this is a four-door vehicle now, not a two-door vehicle. And unlike some of the hybrids in America, this is not a liftback, it's actually a traditional sedan. Up front, this looks an awful lot like the Honda Civic because the Insight is very, very closely related to the Civic, and Honda is not running away from that fact. In some ways, you could look at the Insight as the high-efficiency trim of the Honda Civic, or you could also see this as a standalone model. It's really up to you. The overall length of the Insight is a little bit longer than the Civic sedan, making this one of the larger compact sedans in America. And again, this is a sedan. We have an actual trunk back here, not a liftback like we see in the Ioniq or the Prius. So this is Honda trying to create a slightly different kind of high-efficiency vehicle than we see from Hyundai or Toyota. Most of the inside remains very, very similar, so we find exactly the same combined legroom figures, really the same rear headroom, with a slight reduction because the rear seats are actually slightly higher off the ground. Very similar front seat space as well. As we see with the front of the Insight, the rear end design looks sort of like a grown-up Civic. So if you're looking for something that has perhaps a little bit more mature or a little bit more elegant theme to it, then this could be a good option for you as well. We have combination tail lamp modules, which means that we have incandescent turn signals and some LED elements inside these lamps. Not everything that you're seeing is an LED. Under this hood, we find a variant of the hybrid system that we also see in the Clarity and the Accord hybrid. It actually uses basically the same 1.5-liter four-cylinder engine as the Clarity, but a different electric motor on the other side. The gasoline engine right over here on this side of the engine bay produces 107 horsepower and 99 pound-feet of torque on its own. The electric motor that's mated to the front wheels over there produces 129 horsepower and 197 pound-feet of torque all by itself. When everything is working together, we get 151 horsepower max and 197 pound-feet of torque. But this system requires a little bit of explanation because it is very, very different in terms of operational concept versus what we see in a Prius or in the Hyundai Ioniq. Below about 42 miles an hour or so, the gasoline engine cannot directly mechanically power the front wheels. That's because this is a true serial hybrid below those speeds. The engine produces power, it generates that into electricity via a generator that is directly connected to the engine, and that sends that electrically over there to the electric motor to power the front wheels. When the system is calling for more power than the engine can produce with that generator, it pulls that from the battery pack. When the engine and generator are producing more power than the front wheels need, it puts it back into the battery pack for later use. At vehicle speeds of around 42 miles an hour or greater, they can close a clutch pack over there on that side of the engine bay that will allow the engine to mechanically power the front wheels through a fixed gear ratio. You'd use that in steady state highway travel. But if you needed to climb a hill and more torque was required, then it would actually have to disconnect that clutch pack and then again operate as a serial hybrid with the engine running a generator, the generator sending the power over there to the electric motor. A key consideration with this type of hybrid system, very much like we see in the Outlander plug-in hybrid, is that 151 horsepower happens at specific vehicle speeds, higher than highway speeds really in general. So below speeds where it is actually more advantageous to couple the engine directly to the drive wheels, then you'll only be getting the 129 horsepower that the electric motor can produce all on its own. Overall, I find the front seats in the Insight to be quite comfortable, but it is worth knowing that they're not as adjustable as some of the competition, including top-end trims of the Honda Civic. We don't have any power adjustable lumbar support, for instance, over here on the driver's side, and we do find four-way lumbar in some of the competition. Now, I find the overall seat shape to be fairly supportive for my back, and I do like a decent amount of lumbar support, but if you don't like a lot of lumbar support, then this may not be a good option for you. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and we have a power passenger seat in this top-end touring trim. Overall front seat room is essentially the same as the Honda Civic sedan, which is quite logical because this is the same basic vehicle under the skin. So overall headroom, including the model with the moonroof, legroom, etc., overall it's very, very similar. So if you fit well in the Honda Civic, you're likely going to fit very well in the Insight as well. With 79.7 inches of combined legroom, and that is front row plus second row, this is one of the roomier cabins in the compact sedan category. We find notably more legroom back here, for instance, than in something like a Toyota Prius or a Hyundai Ioniq. Now, on the downside, Honda has packaged the battery in a very practical location, but it does reduce rear headroom. That's because I'm actually sitting on the battery back here. And that's why versus the Honda Civic, we find a little bit less headroom. And that is a little bit of a problem for taller folks in the rear because I can't actually put my head on that headrest in the back. There's just not enough headroom back here. I would have to tilt my head over to the side. You might be wondering what use the extra legroom is back here versus a vehicle that had more headroom and less legroom. The logical reason you would want this additional room back here is for child seats, because if you were to put a rear-facing child seat in the back of this vehicle, it's likely going to fit a little bit better with a taller person up front than something like a Toyota Prius. The fold-down rear seats and that large cargo pass-through are made possible by the location of the hybrid battery, which again is under the rear passenger seats. As we see in the new Accord Hybrid and the Camry Hybrid, the battery location makes a practical and traditional trunk shape possible. So back here we find just over 15 cubic feet of storage space, which is quite large for the compact category. This is actually about the same kind of storage space you'll find in a mid-size sedan like a Toyota Camry. And this trunk is a little bit deeper than you might expect, allowing you to put 22-inch roller bags like that right back there and still close the trunk lid. Now on the downside, this cargo area is not as large or as practical as the cargo areas that we find in the Hyundai Ioniq or the Toyota Prius. As we see with a large number of hybrids, if we lift up the load floor, we don't find a spare tire in here, just a can of Fix-A-Flat and some additional storage. On the bright side, because of the relationship between this and the Honda Civic, there's actually enough room down there to store a compact spare tire if you want to get one for a Civic and put one in yourself aftermarket. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the top-end touring trim, and that's why we find this moonroof right over here above the driver and front passengers' heads. We find height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests for the driver and the front passenger. Inside this interior, we find a combination of Civic parts, Civic design elements, and some unique parts and elements for the Insight as well. We have perforated leather on the front seats, although it's worth noting that these seats are just heated. They're not ventilated like we find in some of the competition's hybrid vehicles. The front doors are made from a decent portion of soft touch material. So we have a soft touch upper section, soft touch insert there in the middle, and a soft touch armrest right there. The rest of the door is made from hard plastics, including this large bottle holder right down there that was easily able to accommodate some of those larger sports drink bottles. Moving over to the dashboard, we find a design that's a little bit different than we find in the Civic. Honda has decided to position the Insight as sort of a premium alternative that's a little bit nicer on the inside, a little bit more elegant on the outside, and a little bit more efficient than the Civic. And that's definitely what we see here. So we have some stitch material on the midsection of the dash, soft touch materials on the upper section of the dash, and then hard plastics lower. For instance, around this bin-style glove compartment right there, I was able to fit a large tablet computer inside without a problem. Since we're driving the top-end trim, we have a center channel speaker right there in the middle of the dash. We also have two large air vents here, and then we find the latest version of Honda's infotainment software right here in the middle of the dashboard. This fully supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, as you can see right there. Very much like the infotainment system that we see in the new Honda Odyssey as well as the new Honda Accord, we have the ability to customize the home page. Right there you can see we have some different color tiles that help you find the option that you want a little bit more easily, like the dedicated hybrid screen right there. We can click back over to things like our source right up there at the top, built-in factory navigation, which is optional. And then some of you will be happy to know that there are physical buttons again on the left side. So we actually have physical buttons for track forward, backward, dimmer, back, home, and the power and volume knob. Continuing down from the screen, we find dual zone automatic climate control right here. This is also where you'll find the buttons to control the heated seats. 2 USB inputs right there for the infotainment system and a spot where you can stick your smartphone right next to that 12-volt power port. We then have the same sort of button-style shifter arrangement that we see in other Honda and Acura vehicles. We press this button for drive, pull back right there for reverse, that's the neutral button, and then park is that button at the top. Below that we have our electric parking brake, automatic brake hold, and then mode buttons for the drivetrain. We have Econ, Sport, and then an EV mode, pretty much like you'd find in most hybrids out there. Between the front seats, we find a center console that's inspired by what we see in the Honda Civic. So we have a sliding armrest section right there. It also lifts up and out of the way to give us access to a very large and long storage compartment. In the storage compartment, we have the cup holders. Those can slide around like that. You can also snap in a smaller divider that runs on a similar rail to the cup holders right there. Both of these modules can be completely removed if you'd like to. As we see in some of Honda's other new products, we find a partial LCD instrument cluster. So everything that we see from this power gauge over here on the left to just on the other side of the speedometer is part of the LCD. On the right side of the screen, we find the fuel level, and then on the left side of the screen, not part of the LCD, we find the battery charge indicator. The LCD gives us all the usual gauges you'd expect out of a hybrid, for instance, where the power is going. Right now we're in park. The engine is on, it's charging the battery, as you can see right there. When the vehicle is in drive or in reverse, this blue section of the power gauge roughly indicates where the vehicle would be able to stay in EV mode. This display is controlled via a button arrangement on the steering wheel. We can choose just the power gauge only if we so desired. We can choose an eco drive screen to help coach us to drive more efficiently. Power screen that we saw there before. Range and average fuel economy. We can get just a fuel economy screen of the last 3 drive trips, last 3 cycles of that ignition. We have a speed and time display, average speed, elapsed time, an audio display right there. You can see what's playing, including album art from a connected CarPlay source. We have our phone interface, which doesn't do too much good, of course, because we have Apple CarPlay connected. Navigation, that would be the factory navigation system, traffic sign information, driving support systems, driver attention monitoring, etc. The steering wheel design is very similar to some of Honda's other products. We have sport grips up top and a slight sport grip shape down there towards the bottom of the steering wheel as well. There are paddles on the back of the steering wheel. They're used for the regenerative braking system. So you can increase the regen braking with this paddle over here on the left, decrease it with the paddle over here on the right. Now that seems kind of odd initially because they are labeled minus and plus. And in Honda speak, that is sort of minus is more braking and plus is less braking. Over here on this side, we find volume up, down, toggle for track forward and backward. Then this rotary knob, the home button, and the back button are used for that multifunction LCD. We then have some dedicated phone buttons, voice command button, and then on the right side we have the buttons for the standard radar adaptive cruise control system. Honda's latest Honda Sensing is standard on all Insight models, and that includes radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, automatic high beams, and autonomous braking. When the Insight and the Prius first came on the scene in the United States, hybrids were definitely a novelty. And because of their price tag, because of the way they drove, the way they handled, etc., it was really difficult to compare them directly to other vehicles that were similarly sized but not hybridized. But now in the 21st century, things are just a little bit different because the Insight drives very much like your average compact sedan. It handles very much like a Honda Civic. And we see basically the same thing out of the Hyundai Ioniq. I actually think the Ioniq handles better and feels better out on the road than the Hyundai Elantra. Things are a little bit different when we talk about the Insight versus the Civic than the Elantra versus the Ioniq, because I don't think this is quite as engaging as most versions of the Civic, although it is very close because it is, again, very closely related to that Civic. Overall acceleration happens in 7.9 seconds. That's between the naturally aspirated engine and the turbo engine that we find in the Civic. The turbocharged Civic will do 0 to 60 in 6.6 seconds, which is very quick for a mid-level engine in a compact sedan. Remember that Honda has several different engine tunes that are more powerful than that. We have the Civic Sport, the Civic Si, and of course the Civic Type R. All of them will go faster than that Turbo Civic, and of course all of them will be faster than this Insight here as well. But of course the Insight isn't about acceleration, it's about fuel economy, which we'll talk about in a bit. In our braking tests, this model stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 121 feet, which is interestingly enough exactly the same distance that it took a Honda Civic Coupe that we last tested. The current generation Honda Civic is one of the best handling compact sedans you can get in America, and a lot of that translates directly into the inside, although this doesn't have quite the same kind of edge that we find in the Civic. Some of that has to do with the overall weight of the vehicle. This is a little bit heavier than the Civic, and I think some of that has to do with the tire choice that we find, even when compared against Honda Civics with 215 width tires. Now keep in mind, you can get Civics, especially those top-end trims, with even wider tires than we have on this model, and that will definitely improve your handling ability. But if you were willing to sacrifice some fuel economy for improved handling, you could logically put those wider tires and grippier tires on this model and still get that better handling ability. One of the big things that you'll notice about the Insight is the overall level of suspension polish. At 50 miles an hour, we've recorded 72 decibels inside this cabin. Now keep in mind that our cabin noise test is done on a level road surface at 50 miles an hour. Now, if you are going up a hill at 50 miles an hour, then you're going to get a great deal more engine noise because of the nature of this hybrid system. This engine is a little bit rougher around the edges than the 1.5 liter turbo that we find in the Civic or the 2 liter naturally aspirated engine that we find in the Civic as well. And there's a little bit less sound deadening under the hood than we find in the Honda Clarity, which uses basically the same engine. And that's why this appears to be a little bit louder than some of those alternatives. Overall cabin noise was actually identical to the 1.5 liter turbo Civic, but if you're going uphill, then this is going to be a little bit louder. Some of you have noticed that if you start driving a Honda hybrid with the 2-motor hybrid system a little bit harder, then the engine noises coming from underneath the hood are not always in a direct linear relationship to how hard you seem to be pushing on the accelerator or how fast you're going. That's because, again, this is a true serial hybrid in some modes. So the engine is spinning at whatever rate it thinks it needs to in order to produce the power that's required by the overall vehicle systems, including battery charging. So if you've really depleted that battery back there, the engine is going to need to speed up in order to recharge that battery. It also means that to get acceleration, the engine doesn't need to spin up right away. So I can actually floor the car, you're going to get that acceleration immediately from the electric motor, and then the engine is going to catch up in a little bit. Overall suspension tuning in the Insight is very similar to the Civic, and that would be sort of mainstream versions of the Civic. Obviously, this is not going to be as firm as a Civic Si or the Civic Hatchback Sport, or of course the top-end Civic Type R, but this is going to be very similar to the average compact sedan in America. The model that we're driving, which again is the top-end touring trim, has 17-inch wheels and tires on it. These are 215 width tires, so they're not as wide as some of the top-end versions of the Civic, and most importantly, there's a little bit more sidewall than we see in some of the top-end trims of the competition, and that helps give us a little bit of extra cushion out on the road. The overall level of polish we find in the Insight suspension is absolutely excellent for a hybrid or a non-hybrid in this segment. There are a lot of vehicles in this mainstream compact car segment that don't have an independent rear suspension and don't have the same level of attention to detail when it comes to overall suspension dynamics that we find in the Civic or now in the Insight. And that really does help improve not only the handling but also the ride in this vehicle. Because if you start driving this car harder out on your favorite winding mountain road, the rear suspension never feels upset. When it comes to our overall fuel economy score, I'm going to have to give this model a B, because I am just a little bit disappointed with our real-world mileage figures. This is supposed to be about as fuel efficient as some of those other dedicated hybrids that we find in the compact segment, but in our fuel economy tests, we've been averaging about 40 miles per gallon, which is a little bit below what the EPA says we should get in this top-end touring trim. Now, obviously, that is still better than a Honda Civic with the 1.5 liter turbo or the base engine, and indeed, better fuel economy than you'll find in your average compact sedan in America, without question. If you're driving this in city traffic, especially a lot of stop-and-go traffic, then fuel economy is going to be very, very good. We were trapped in some highway traffic and that was stop-and-go for about 30-45 minutes or so, and we were averaging about 55-60 miles per gallon in those situations. But my daily commute doesn't involve stop-and-go traffic all the time. It involves some highway travel, some mountain highway travel, etc. And those are the terrains where this system seems to let us down a little bit. If you're hill climbing, this seems to be a little bit less efficient than a Toyota Prius. And if you're going higher speeds out on the highway especially, then this is going to be a little bit less efficient. That's something that we've noticed in Honda's hybrid systems in the past. That's just due to the overall design of the hybrid system and the fact that there is that fixed ratio once the engine is mechanically sending power to the front wheels. If you're going about 60 or 65 miles an hour, then things are pretty efficient and you're definitely going to be getting around that EPA score. But if you're driving on highways where the speed limit is higher and you're going 70, 75 miles an hour, or perhaps even 80 in some states out there, then your fuel economy is going to be notably lower than the EPA score. That's just because the engine is going to be spinning faster and there's no higher ratio that this vehicle can choose from in order to try and help improve that overall fuel economy score. That's similar to what we saw in the Clarity and of course the Accord Hybrid. But I have to say that our overall fuel economy average in the Clarity was very impressive because of its larger battery pack, and I do drive on winding mountain roads like I'm on right here regularly. This battery gets completely full before we've gone maybe more than about a quarter of the way down the hill, and the Clarity can actually recapture all that energy and then help improve our fuel economy score. Bottom line, the Insight is fuel efficient, it's fun to drive, and it has a more grown-up character than the Honda Civic, which I do appreciate. One of the things that I really like about Honda's hybrid system is that this is just like driving an EV. More so than driving a Toyota Prius, and very unlike driving a Hyundai Ioniq. The Ioniq feels very much like a traditional car because it has a 6-speed automatic. It feels very traditional. The Toyota Prius sometimes feels like an EV and sometimes feels like a car with a CVT. This really does feel like an EV because under 40 miles an hour, it is. If I press on the accelerator pedal, whether the engine is on or off, the acceleration is very linear like an electric vehicle. We get the little bit of electric motor whine in there. We also get fairly aggressive regen braking thanks to the large electric motor and the fact that this vehicle has a novel approach to regenerative braking. If the battery is completely full, as it is now, and I need more regen braking, instead of turning off the regen like we see in some hybrids or spinning up the engine mechanically like we see in the Toyota Prius, this vehicle will actually regenerate power using the drive motor and then use the generator to spin the engine and basically consume that extra electricity. That may sound a little funny, but the reality is that it gives you very, very consistent brake feel and very consistent regen braking feel as you're going downhill, uphill, etc. This vehicle is always going to feel the same, whereas other hybrids in America may actually feel a little bit different depending on the state of charge for your battery. Honda isn't pricing the Insight quite as aggressively as some of the competition. For 2019, it'll start at $22,830, and that's for the LX trim. Now, when comparing the Insight against the Honda Civic, it's important to remember that the trim levels don't exactly equal the same feature content in both vehicles, although they're relatively similar. The base LX trim is going to be that 52 mile per gallon combined model, although it has basically the same tire width that we find in the top-end Touring trim. Honda sensing is standard, as we find in most new Hondas for 2019, so that includes that radar adaptive cruise control system, pre-collision braking, lane keeping assistance, etc. LED headlamps are also standard, so that's important to keep in mind as well when comparing this against some of the competitors. Then we have the next step up, the EX trim, also 52 miles per gallon combined. Versus the Honda Civic, we don't find a moonroof in this particular trim, but we do get that 60/40 folding rear seat back that we saw in this video, as well as Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. In my mind, I really consider that EX trim to be the real base trim because that gets us those nicer features on the inside, that 8-speaker audio system, etc. And of course, if you want the fully loaded model, we end up at $28,090 for the Touring trim. That's a relatively compact range between the bottom end and the top end. The Touring trim, of course, gets us the leather upholstery that we saw in this particular model, moonroof, dual zone climate control, etc. With that out of the way, let's move on to the Hyundai Ioniq. The last time we reviewed the Ioniq Hybrid, I said that it was really a no-compromises hybrid, and really one of the first in America. The Ioniq handles better than the average compact sedan in America, and we get considerably better fuel economy in that model. Hyundai has also been very aggressive at the pricing. It starts at $22,200, a little bit lower than we find the Insight. It does top out a little bit more expensive than the Insight, but we also find a few features in that vehicle that we don't find in the Honda. Handling is absolutely excellent in the Ioniq, and that was really one of the big surprises for this vehicle. I still think that the Honda Civic handles a little bit better than the Ioniq, but actually depending on the Ioniq version you're looking at versus the Insight, the Ioniq may actually handle a little bit better than the Insight. When it comes to overall acceleration ability, however, the Insight definitely wins here because we get more power out of Honda's two-motor hybrid system. The Hyundai Ioniq fights back with a higher level of practicality thanks to its overall liftback design. We have an awful lot of cargo capacity in the back. When it comes to overall feel, the two vehicles are very different. The Insight, as I said before, feels very much like an EV, whereas the Ioniq actually feels more like a traditional car and less like a hybrid. That's because power still flows through a 6-speed stepped automatic transmission. When it comes to fuel economy, the Ioniq definitely beats the Insight, whether we're talking about the most fuel-efficient model, which is one of the most efficient vehicles available in America, or the average or upper-end trims compared to the average or upper-end trims of the Insight as well. Next up, we have the Toyota Prius. The Prius is a little bit more expensive than the Insight, starting at $23,475 and going on up to about $32,000, depending on exactly what you want in your Prius. The Prius has long been a practical, reliable, and definitely efficient entry in this segment. The Prius will routinely get well over the EPA average score, especially if you start treating it nicely. And that's a little bit different than we see in either the Ioniq or in the Honda Insight. Both the Ioniq and the Insight tend to drop a little bit below EPA scores depending on how you drive them, especially in our driving cycle. We had difficulties matching the top-end fuel economy numbers, not just in the Insight, but also in the Ioniq, although the Ioniq averaged a little bit better than the Honda. The Prius has a very classic hybrid feel, so if you don't like the way that some people describe the way the Prius drives, you're going to want one of the other options. It doesn't feel quite like an electric vehicle, and it doesn't feel quite like a traditional car either. It also doesn't really feel like a car with a CVT, for instance, the Honda Civic. It actually has a very different feel than all of those together, so you probably ought to drive one if you're looking at them to see if that's something that you like. The interior is a little bit more futuristic, but I don't think it's as nice looking or as nice feeling as what we find in the Insight, and the overall look I don't think is quite as attractive either. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more elegant, that's definitely going to be the Insight, but if you want those high fuel economy numbers, that is definitely going to be the Prius. Next up, we have what I think is the most direct competitor for the Insight, the Honda Civic on which it is based. $19,740 will buy you a Civic LX with a continuously variable transmission. That's about $3,000 less than a Honda Insight. When you take a look at the overall fuel economy, you will average about $400 less a year in terms of operational cost in the Insight, but that will take you 6 to 7 years to actually recoup. So if you do plan on keeping your car for 10 years or longer, you will save on the fuel in the Insight, but it may take a while. Of course, if fuel costs go up, then that period will drop down a little bit. If you move on up to the EX trim of the Civic, that's $21,340, and the delta between the EX trim and the Insight narrows a little bit. We get more power in the Insight for better acceleration, but we don't get the moonroof that we find in that EX trim of the Civic. The overall break-even time ends up right around 5 to 6 years, depending on how much you're paying for fuel in your particular area. And that window will drop even further if you look at the Touring trim of the Civic, because the Touring trim is $26,800. It's about $1,300 bump between it and the top-end Touring trim of the Insight. But you have to keep in mind that we don't find all of the same features in the Insight Touring that we find in the Civic Touring. So although the Insight is an upgrade in terms of overall power from the LX and EX trim, it actually is a downgrade from the EXT through the Touring trim at the top that use that turbocharged engine. On the bright side, the payback versus the Civic Touring is the narrowest, with the Touring model at about 3.5 years based on current fuel costs. When it comes to overall handling ability, the two vehicles are very, very similar, and the overall feel is again very similar as well. But the Honda Civic is still going to beat the Insight, especially in those top-end trims or the sporty trims of the Civic. And that's before we talk about the Civic Si or the Civic Type R. On the flip side, I do think that the Insight is a little bit more attractive, a little bit more grown-up, perhaps a little bit more elegant, both inside the cabin and outside the cabin. So if you're looking for a Honda Civic that feels more premium or just a Honda Civic with a twist, then the Insight is going to be a very, very good option for you. However, if my money were on the line, I have to say, I would still buy a Civic Turbo over the Insight. The reason is really that payback time and the fact that that turbocharged engine in the Honda Civic is just so good. It's powerful, it's efficient compared to the category, and again, the payback time is going to be a little on the long side. If, on the other hand, you're specifically looking for a hybrid entry in this segment, and a no-compromises hybrid at that, then I have to say I would probably take the Hyundai Ioniq hybrid over the Honda Insight, and it would be a close call, but that would be my selection. I'm willing to give up the extra performance that we find in the Insight, and again, it is a pretty big delta between that and the Ioniq. The Ioniq is definitely on the slow side, but the fuel economy is considerably better, and the overall practicality is definitely better in the Ioniq as well. The Ioniq does an impressive job at being a very well-rounded vehicle overall. The handling is actually very, very good in the Ioniq because it gets an independent rear suspension, just like we find in most Honda vehicles. And that really has a big effect on the overall handling ability and the handling feel. That's one of the big differences between it and the related Hyundai Elantra. The Elantra does not get an independent rear suspension, interestingly enough. So there we have it. My two top picks continue to be the Honda Civic and the Hyundai Ioniq. Let me know what you think about that and whether you would get the Insight over either of those two options down there in the comment section below. Be sure to hit that subscribe button as well. Click on those related videos that you'll see on your screen up at the top of your screen. If you want to support this channel, that'll take you over to patreon.com. And now at the bottom of the screen, you'll also see that you can buy merchandise. You can buy Alex and Otto's t-shirts down there. Be sure and click on over to Teespring if you want one of those. I'll see you later.